On April 7, 1945, at exactly 2:23 in the afternoon, the largest battleship ever constructed by human hands began her final descent into the cold waters of the East China Sea. The Yamato, a vessel so massive that her main guns could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds over 25 miles, was dying. And with her, the dreams of an empire that had once believed itself invincible. But this story does not begin in those dark waters. It begins years earlier, in a secret shipyard where Japanese engineers worked in complete secrecy to create a weapon that would change naval warfare forever. A weapon so powerful, so enormous, that the Japanese High Command declared with absolute certainty that she could never be sunk. 386 American planes would prove them catastrophically wrong. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of hubris, heroism, and the deadliest naval air attack in history, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life, stories of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, fighting for survival against impossible odds. Now let us travel back to 1937, to a heavily guarded shipyard in Kure, Japan, where the most ambitious naval construction project in human history was about to begin. The men who walked through the gates of the Kure Naval Arsenal each morning had no idea they were building a legend. They knew only that the project was classified at the highest level, that speaking of their work meant death, and that the ship taking shape before their eyes was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Her keel was laid on November 4, 1937, in a dry dock that had been specially deepened and widened to accommodate her massive hull. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, their movements shrouded in secrecy so absolute that even their families did not know the nature of their work. Takeshi Yamamoto was one of these workers. At 32 years old, he was a master welder who had spent his entire adult life building ships for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he saw rising from the dry dock floor. The numbers alone were staggering. The Yamato would displace 72,800 tons when fully loaded, making her nearly 50% heavier than any battleship ever built by the United States or Great Britain. Her length stretched 863 feet, longer than 2.5 football fields placed end to end. Her beam, Mohammed, measured 127 feet across, so wide that she could not pass through the Panama Canal even if the Americans had allowed it. But it was her armament that truly set her apart. 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, arranged in 3 massive triple turrets. Each gun barrel weighed 162 tons. Each shell, the Type 91 armor-piercing round, weighed 3,219 pounds and could penetrate 16 inches of steel armor at a range of 22 miles. Takeshi remembered the day they installed the first of those great guns. The turret assembly alone weighed more than an entire destroyer. Cranes groaned under the strain as the massive steel structure was lowered into position. And the workers stood in awed silence, understanding for the first time the true scale of what they were creating. The ship's armor was equally formidable. Her main belt consisted of steel plates 16 inches thick, angled at 20 degrees to deflect incoming shells. Her deck armor reached almost 8 inches in critical areas, designed to protect against plunging fire from long-range engagements. Her conning tower was encased in nearly 20 inches of hardened steel. The Japanese naval architects had designed the Yamato to be virtually immune to any weapon that could be brought against her. They had studied every battleship engagement in history, analyzed the vulnerability that had doomed other vessels, and systematically eliminated each weakness. Or so they believed. What they failed to anticipate, what they could not have foreseen in 1937 when the keel was laid, was that the age of the battleship was already ending. In just 4 years, a surprise attack on an American naval base in Hawaii would demonstrate that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate the wars of the future. But in those years of construction, the Yamato represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, the physical embodiment of the empire's determination to dominate the Pacific. She was launched on August 8, 1940, sliding into the water of Kure Harbor, while workers watched in silent pride. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by those with the highest security clearances. There were no crowds, no celebrations, no newspaper reporters to document the event. The Yamato's existence remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Fitting out continued for another 16 months. Thousands of workers installed equipment, tested systems, and prepared the great ship for her destiny. Takeshi Yamamoto worked 16-hour days during those months, welding, adjusting, perfecting. He took pride in his work, believing that he was contributing to something that would protect his homeland and ensure Japan's place among the great powers. He could not have known that he was building a tomb for more than 3,000 men. The Yamato was commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. As America reeled from the devastating blow to her Pacific fleet, Japan celebrated in secret the completion of her mightiest weapon. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later become known as the father of the kamikaze program, inspected the ship shortly after her commissioning. Standing on her bridge, looking down at the vast expanse of her deck, he reportedly said that the Yamato was worth 10,000 aircraft. It was a statement that would prove tragically ironic. The ship's first captain was Gihachi Takayanagi, a veteran officer who had spent his entire career preparing for command of a vessel exactly like this one. He walked her decks with something approaching reverence, running his hands along the cold steel of her gun turrets, standing in silence before the massive anchor chains that weighed more than most fishing boats. Under his command, the Yamato conducted sea trials that confirmed everything her designers had promised. Her top speed exceeded 27 knots, fast for a ship her size. Her guns performed flawlessly, their thunderous reports echoing across the test ranges like the voice of an angry god. Her crew, hand-picked from the finest sailors in the Imperial Japanese Navy, moved with precision and pride. For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, the Yamato served primarily as a floating headquarters. She was too valuable, her commanders believed, to risk in combat. While smaller ships engaged the Americans in brutal battles across the Pacific, the Yamato waited in harbor, her guns silent, her crew growing restless. This caution had a certain logic. The Yamato consumed vast quantities of fuel oil, a resource that was becoming increasingly scarce as American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. Each mission required careful calculation, balancing the strategic value of deploying the great battleship against the cost of the fuel she would consume. But there was something else at play, something the admirals did not speak of openly. The Yamato had become more than a weapon. She had become a symbol, a physical representation of Japan's naval might and imperial destiny. To lose her would be more than a military defeat. It would be a spiritual catastrophe, a blow to national morale that might never heal. And so she waited, growing older while the war turned against Japan, while American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, drawing ever closer to the home islands. Her first real combat came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Yamato was part of the massive Japanese fleet that sought to destroy the American invasion force at Saipan. For the first time, her great guns spoke in anger, their shells arcing toward distant targets. But the battle did not unfold as the Japanese had hoped. American submarines sank 2 of Japan's fleet carriers before the engagement even began. American aircraft, launched from carriers that the Japanese could not locate, devastated the remaining Japanese air groups in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Yamato survived the battle without damage, but the defeat was crushing. Japan lost 3 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. More importantly, the battle demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers, not battleships, ruled the seas of the Pacific War. 4 months later, in October 1944, the Yamato saw action again at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. As part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, she steamed through the San Bernardino Strait to attack the American landing forces in Leyte Gulf. On the morning of October 25th, the Yamato found herself in the midst of the battle off Samar, engaging a small American task force of escort carriers and destroyers. It should have been a slaughter. The Yamato's guns could destroy any ship in the American force with a single hit. But the Americans fought with desperate courage. Their destroyers charged directly at the Japanese fleet, launching torpedoes and firing their small guns at the towering battleships. Their aircraft, armed with whatever weapons could be loaded in the chaos of battle, attacked again and again. The Yamato fired 104 shells from her main batteries during the engagement, but scored no confirmed hits on the American escort carriers. Her massive guns, designed to engage enemy battleships at extreme range, proved surprisingly ineffective against the small maneuvering targets that darted through the smoke and spray of combat. Admiral Kurita, confused by the ferocity of American resistance and fearing a trap, ordered his fleet to withdraw before they could annihilate the American task force. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and that remains controversial among naval historians to this day. The Yamato returned to Japan, her crew shaken by the experience. They had seen American courage up close, had watched as tiny destroyers charged their mighty battleship without hesitation. They had learned that size and firepower were not everything, that the spirit of the men who manned the ships mattered as much as the steel that surrounded them. As 1945 began, Japan's situation grew desperate. American bombers rained destruction on Japanese cities. American submarines had all but eliminated Japan's merchant fleet. American forces captured Iwo Jima in February, bringing the home islands within range of fighter escort for the devastating B-29 raids. And then, on April 1st, 1945, the Americans landed on Okinawa. Okinawa was different from the other islands the Americans had captured. It was Japanese soil, part of the home islands, just 300 miles from Kyushu. Its fall would give the Americans airfields and harbors from which to launch the final invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese command knew they had to respond, but their options were limited. The combined fleet had been shattered in the battles of 1944. Fuel oil was so scarce that most remaining warships could not leave harbor. The Navy's air groups had been decimated, their best pilots killed in battles stretching from Midway to the Philippine Sea. What remained was the Yamato, and a plan so desperate that it could only be born of desperation. On April 5, 1945, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito received orders that he knew were a death sentence. The Yamato, along with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa. They would beach themselves on the island's shores, using their guns as coastal artillery to support the Japanese garrison until their ammunition was exhausted. The crews would then abandon ship and join the ground forces in defending the island. There would be no air cover, there would be no realistic chance of survival. The mission was, in essence, a kamikaze attack on a massive scale. Ito understood immediately what this meant. He had studied naval warfare his entire adult life, had watched as aircraft carriers had revolutionized combat at sea. He knew that a surface fleet without air cover, sailing into waters dominated by American carrier groups, had no chance of reaching its objective. But he also understood duty. He understood that Japan was fighting for her survival, that every day the war continued meant more American bombers over Japanese cities, more Japanese civilians dying in the flames. If the sacrifice of the Yamato and her crew could buy even a few more days for Okinawa's defenders, it might be worth the cost. He gathered his officers in the Yamato's wardroom on the evening of April 5th. The room was silent as he explained the mission, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. He told them that they would be sailing into certain death, that the chances of reaching Okinawa were virtually zero. Then he gave them a choice. Any officer who wished to leave the ship could do so without dishonor. The mission was voluntary, he said, and no one would think less of those who chose to live. Not a single officer left. Among those who stayed was Lieutenant Commander Mitsuru Yoshida, who would later write one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of the Yamato's final voyage. He was 32 years old, married, with a young daughter he had not seen in months. He thought of them as he sat in that wardroom, listening to Admiral Ito explain how they would die. But he did not leave. None of them did. The enlisted men were not given the same choice. They were told only that they would be sailing on an important mission, that they should write letters to their families and prepare their affairs. Many of them understood what this meant. They had seen enough of the war to recognize a one-way trip when they saw one. That night, the Yamato's crew wrote their final letters home. Some were brief, formal expressions of duty and honor. Others poured out emotions that Japanese culture normally kept hidden, declarations of love for wives and children and parents who would never see them again. Ensign Mitsuo Watanabe, just 22 years old, wrote to his mother that he was proud to serve aboard the greatest ship in the Navy, that he hoped she would not grieve too long for him, that he would meet her again in the next life. He sealed the letter carefully, addressed it in his neat handwriting, and placed it in the mail bag that would be sent ashore before the ship departed. The letters were collected and sent to Kura, where naval officials would hold them until confirmation of the ship's fate. It was a ritual that had become all too common in the Japanese Navy of 1945. On the morning of April 6, 1945, the Yamato weighed anchor and steamed out of Tokuyama Bay. The weather was clear, the sea calm, the cherry blossoms blooming on the hills above the harbor. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful spring day. The crew stood at attention as the great ship passed through the harbor entrance, their white uniforms crisp against the gray steel of the deck. On the shore, a small group of officers and workers watched in silence. There were no bands playing, no flags waving, no crowds cheering. Everyone understood that this was not a departure. It was a funeral procession. The task force formed up outside the harbor, the Yamato in the center, surrounded by her escorts. The light cruiser Yahagi took position ahead, her captain scanning the skies for the American aircraft they all knew would come. The 8 destroyers spread out in a protective screen, their crews already manning their anti-aircraft guns. Vice Admiral Ito stood on the Yamato's bridge, watching his small fleet take shape. He had commanded many ships in his career, had fought in battles across the Pacific, but he had never felt the weight of command more heavily than he did at that moment. He knew the Americans would be tracking them. He knew that reconnaissance aircraft would spot the task force within hours of their departure. He knew that the American carriers would launch everything they had. The moment the Yamato was within range. What he did not know was that the Americans had been reading Japanese naval codes for years, that they already knew about Operation Tengo, that Admiral Raymond Spruance was even now positioning his forces to intercept them. The Yamato steamed south through the Bungo Strait, passing between the islands of Kyushu and Shikoku. The crew settled into the routine of sea travel, standing their watches, maintaining their equipment, trying not to think too much about what lay ahead. In the engine rooms, deep in the bowels of the ship, the stokers fed fuel oil into the massive boilers that drove her turbines. The heat was oppressive, the noise deafening, but the men worked with quiet efficiency. Many of them had served aboard the Yamato since her commissioning, knew every valve and gauge in their domains, took pride in keeping the great engines running smoothly. Chief Petty Officer Saburo Hayashi had been an engineer for 15 years. He was 41 years old for an enlisted man, with a wife and 3 children waiting for him in Yokohama. He had survived the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, had watched from his station far below the waterline as the ship shook from near misses and torpedo explosions. He had made peace with the likelihood of his death months ago. The Navy had been his life, the Yamato his home. If he had to die, he could think of no better place than at his post, keeping her engines running until the very end. As the sun set on April 6th, the Yamato and her escorts cleared the southern tip of Kyushu and turned west into the East China Sea. Ahead lay Okinawa, more than 400 miles away. Behind them, the mountains of Japan faded into the gathering darkness. Many of the crew stood on deck that evening, watching their homeland disappear over the horizon. For most of them, it would be the last time they ever saw Japan. The night passed without incident. The task force steamed westward at 22 knots, maintaining radio silence, hoping against hope that they might reach Okinawa undetected. But Ito knew this was wishful thinking. The Americans had eyes everywhere, submarines lurking beneath the waves, aircraft patrolling the sea lanes. Sure enough, at dawn on April 7th, an American submarine spotted the task force and reported its position. Within hours, reconnaissance aircraft from the American carriers had confirmed the sighting and tracked the Japanese ships as they turned south toward Okinawa. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Ito received the news with grim acceptance. The Americans knew where they were. The attack would come soon. He ordered the crew to general quarters, sending every man to his battle station. The anti-aircraft guns were loaded and trained skyward. The damage control party stood ready with their equipment. The surgeons laid out their instruments in the ship's hospital, preparing for the casualties they knew would come. At 8 in the morning, the first American aircraft appeared on the horizon. They were scout planes sent to shadow the Japanese fleet and report its movements. They stayed well out of range of the Yamato's guns, circling like vultures waiting for their prey to weaken. The hours that followed were torture for the Japanese crews. They knew the attack was coming, knew that somewhere over the horizon, American carriers were launching wave after wave of aircraft. They could only wait, watching the skies, listening for the drone of engines that would announce their doom. At 10 minutes after 12 noon, the first wave appeared. 280 American aircraft, a mix of Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes, descended on the Japanese task force from the northeast. They had launched from the carriers of Task Force 58, the most powerful naval strike force in history. The Japanese lookouts spotted them when they were still 15 miles away, a swarm of dark shapes against the gray sky. The alarm bells rang throughout the ship, though every man was already at his station. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida, watching from his position near the bridge, would later describe the attack as something from a nightmare. The aircraft seemed to come from everywhere at once, diving through the flak, releasing their weapons, pulling away as new attackers took their place. The first torpedo struck the Yamato at 12:41 in the afternoon, hitting her portside amidships. The explosion tore a hole in her hull below the waterline, sending a shudder through the entire ship. Water began pouring into the compartments on the port side, and the great battleship began to list slightly to port. Within minutes, 2 more torpedoes found their mark. Then a bomb struck near the forward main battery, starting a fire that would burn for the rest of the battle. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns blazed away, their crews working with desperate efficiency, but there were simply too many targets. In the engine rooms, Chief Hayashi felt the ship shuddering around him as torpedo after torpedo struck home. The damage reports came crackling over the intercom, listing compartments flooding, systems failing, casualties mounting. He kept his men focused on their work, maintaining power to the guns, keeping the ship moving. But they were fighting a losing battle. The Yamato's designers had prepared her to fight other battleships and swarms of aircraft attacking from every direction. Her anti-aircraft defenses, though numerous, could not cope with the overwhelming numbers of American planes. At 1:10 in the afternoon, the first wave withdrew, but there was no time for relief. A second wave was already approaching, 106 more aircraft thirsting for blood. By this point, the Yamato had taken 5 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. Her port side was flooding badly, and her list had increased to 5 degrees. Counter-flooding measures were helping, but they could only do so much. The ship was still fighting, her guns still blazing, but she was wounded. Admiral Ito stood on the bridge, watching the second wave approach. He had known this would happen, had prepared himself for it, but the reality was worse than anything he had imagined. His ship was dying around him, and there was nothing he could do to save her. The second wave struck with even greater fury than the first. The American pilots had learned from the first attack, had identified the Yamato's weaknesses, had coordinated their assaults with deadly precision. 4 more torpedoes slammed into the port side, each explosion adding to the flooding, increasing the list. Bombs rained down on the deck, killing gun crews, starting fires, destroying equipment. The Yamato staggered under the assault, her massive hull groaning as the water poured in. At 1:33, another torpedo hit the starboard side, the first to strike that flank. It was a cruel irony. The hit helped reduce the port list temporarily, but it also meant that both sides of the ship were now taking on water. In the hospital below decks, the surgeons worked frantically to save the wounded. The casualties were overwhelming, men burned by fires, torn by shrapnel, crushed by falling debris. The doctors did what they could, but there were too many wounded and too few supplies. Ensign Watanabe, the young officer who had written to his mother the night before, was killed at his anti-aircraft station at 1:45. A bomb struck nearby, and he simply ceased to exist. His body was never recovered. By 2 in the afternoon, the Yamato's situation was desperate. She had taken 10 torpedoes and 7 bomb hits. Her port list had increased to 15 degrees, so severe that her starboard propellers were lifting out of the water. Her speed had dropped to 7 knots, barely enough to maintain steerage. Admiral Ito ordered the crew to abandon ship. It was an agonizing decision, an admission of defeat, but he could not let his men die needlessly. The ship was doomed, and every moment they stayed aboard reduced their chances of survival. But many of the crew did not receive the order. Communications had been disrupted by the damage, and in the chaos of battle, many men simply did not know that abandonment had been authorized. They stayed at their posts, fighting to the end. In the engine rooms, Chief Hayashi heard the order through the intercom static. He looked at his men, saw the exhaustion and fear in their faces, and made a decision. He ordered them to evacuate, to climb the ladders to the upper decks and take their chances in the water. He would stay behind to keep the engines running as long as possible. His men protested, but he insisted. He was an old man, he told them. He had lived a good life. They were young, with families waiting for them, futures still to live. They should go. One by one, they climbed the ladders, leaving him alone in the depths of the dying ship. He never made it out. At 2:20 in the afternoon, the Yamato's list reached 20 degrees, and her fate was sealed. The massive ship began to capsize, her port rail dipping beneath the waves as her starboard side rose into the air. For the men still aboard, there was a moment of terrible clarity as the deck tilted beneath their feet, as gravity suddenly shifted, as the ship they had lived in and loved began her final roll. Admiral Ito retreated to his cabin moments before the end. He had decided to go down with his ship, as tradition demanded, as honor required. He locked the door behind him and waited for the sea to claim him. Captain Kosaku Ariga, who had commanded the Yamato for only 3 months, lashed himself to the compass on the bridge. He refused to leave his post, refused to abandon the ship he had sworn to protect. He was still there when the waves swept over the bridge. At 2:23 in the afternoon, the Yamato rolled completely over, her massive hull momentarily visible like the belly of a dying whale. Then she sank, her bow rising briefly into the air before plunging beneath the surface. And then she exploded. The detonation of the Yamato's forward magazines was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. A column of fire and smoke rose nearly 4 miles into the sky, visible from over 100 miles away. The shock wave could be felt on the shores of Kyushu, more than 120 miles to the north. Of the 3,332 men who had sailed aboard the Yamato, only 276 survived. More than 3,000 souls went down with her, including Admiral Ito, Captain Ariga, and Chief Hayashi. The light cruiser Yahagi was also sunk, along with 4 of the 8 destroyers. The entire operation had lasted less than 3 hours from the first attack to the final explosion. The American losses were 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. When news of the Yamato's fate reached Japan, it was kept secret from the public. The government could not admit that its mightiest warship had been sunk with such ease that the symbol of Japanese naval power had been destroyed in a matter of hours. But the Navy knew. The admirals and captains and strategists who had believed in the age of the battleship, who had poured their nation's resources into building the ultimate surface warship, understood that an era had ended in the waters of the East China Sea. The Yamato's sinking proved beyond any doubt that aircraft carriers had made battleships obsolete. No amount of armor, no number of guns could protect a surface ship from determined air attack. The future of naval warfare belonged to the carriers and their aircraft, not to the great gun platforms that had dominated the seas for generations. For the survivors, the ordeal was far from over. They clung to wreckage in the cold waters, watching their shipmates die from wounds and exposure, hoping against hope for rescue. The destroyers that had survived the attack worked frantically to pull men from the sea, but many were too badly wounded or too far from help. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida was among the survivors. He had been blown off the ship by the final explosion, had somehow found himself in the water, clinging to a piece of debris. He watched the Yamato explode, watched the pillar of fire rise into the sky, and understood that his world had changed forever. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to honor the memory of his shipmates, trying to explain to future generations what it had meant to serve aboard the greatest battleship ever built. In his memoir, published years after the war, he wrote that the Yamato represented both the best and worst of Japan. She was a magnificent feat of engineering, a testament to Japanese skill and determination. But she was also a symbol of hubris, of a belief that bigger and more powerful weapons could overcome any obstacle. The Americans who had sunk her felt no joy in their victory. Many of them had watched the great ship explode, had seen the pillar of fire rising into the sky, and had understood that they had witnessed something terrible and historic. Commander Richard May, who led one of the torpedo squadrons in the attack, later said that sinking the Yamato felt less like a victory than like an execution. She was magnificent, he said, the most beautiful ship he had ever seen. And they had destroyed her. But there was no choice. The Yamato was heading for Okinawa, where American soldiers and Marines were fighting and dying every day. If she had reached her destination, if her great guns had been turned against the invasion beaches, the cost in American lives would have been catastrophic. The Battle of Okinawa continued for another 2.5 months after. The Yamato's sinking. More than 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese died in the fighting. The island's civilian population suffered terribly, with estimates of civilian casualties ranging from 40,000 to 150,000. The Yamato's sacrifice had changed nothing. She had not reached Okinawa, had not fired her guns in support of the defenders, had not bought even a single day's delay for the Americans. 3,000 men had died for nothing. Or had they? In Japan, the Yamato's loss was seen as the final proof that the war was lost. Some historians argue that her sinking helped convince the emperor and his advisors that continued resistance was futile, that surrender was the only way to save what remained of Japan. Whether this is true or not, the Yamato has become a symbol of Japan's experience in World War II. She represents the nation's ambition and its defeat, its technological achievement and its strategic blindness, its courage, and its tragedy. Today, the wreck of the Yamato lies in more than 1,000 feet of water in the East China Sea. Expeditions have visited the site, have photographed the scattered remains of the once mighty battleship, have paid tribute to the men who died there. The bow section lies upright, still recognizable as the forward portion of a great warship. The massive anchor chains, each link weighing more than 100 pounds, trail away into the darkness. Nearby, the barrel of one of her secondary guns points toward the surface, as if still waiting for enemies that will never come. Fish swim through the ruins now, and coral has begun to grow on the steel. Nature is slowly reclaiming what human ambition created and human conflict destroyed. In another century or two, the Yamato will be unrecognizable, just another reef on the ocean floor. But her story will endure. In Kure, where she was built, a museum preserves her memory. Scale models show her as she appeared in her glory. Days, her guns trained fore and aft, her deck bustling with sailors in white. Artifacts recovered from the wreck are displayed with reverence, each one a connection to the men who served and died aboard her. Children visit the museum with their parents and grandparents, learning about a war that ended decades before they were born. They hear the story of the Yamato, of her construction, and her battles and her death. They see the names of the men who died inscribed on memorial tablets, more than 3,000 names, each one representing a father or son or brother who never came home. And perhaps in learning this story, they understand something about the nature of war. They understand that technology alone cannot guarantee victory, that the biggest and most powerful weapons can be overcome, that courage and sacrifice do not always lead to success. The Japanese High Command had said the Yamato was unsinkable. 386 American planes proved them wrong, but the true lesson of the Yamato is not about the vulnerability of battleships or the supremacy of aircraft carriers. It is about the cost of hubris, the price of overconfidence, the tragedy that unfolds when leaders convince themselves that their creations are invincible. The men who built the Yamato believed they were creating something that would last forever, a weapon so powerful that nothing could stand against it. The men who died aboard her believed they were serving a cause greater than themselves, defending their homeland against an implacable enemy. They were brave men, all of them, Japanese and American alike. They did their duty as they understood it, fought for their countries, gave their lives when asked. Their memories deserve to be honored, even as we recognize the folly that led to their deaths. Because in the end, the Yamato was not defeated by American aircraft. She was defeated by the belief that any weapon, any ship, any creation of human hands could be truly unsinkable. She was defeated by the arrogance that led Japan's leaders to challenge the industrial might of the United States. She was defeated by a strategic blindness that failed to recognize how naval warfare had changed. The 3,000 men who went down with her were the final casualties of that blindness. They paid with their lives for the mistakes of their leaders, as soldiers and sailors have always done, as they continue to do in conflicts around the world. Let us remember them, not as enemies or victims, but as human beings who faced death with courage, who served with honor, who loved their families and their comrades and their country. Let us remember that behind every statistic, every number in a history book, there was a real person with hopes and dreams and fears. Ensign Watanabe, who wrote that final letter to his mother. Chief Hayashi, who stayed at his post so his men could escape. Admiral Ito, who accepted a mission he knew was hopeless because duty demanded it. Captain Origa, who lashed himself to the bridge rather than abandon his command. And the thousands of others whose names we may never know, whose stories were lost in the cold waters of the East China Sea on that spring afternoon in 1945. The Yamato was the largest battleship ever built, the pinnacle of an age of naval warfare that was already ending when her keel was laid. Her destruction marked the final definitive proof that the battleship era was over, that aircraft carriers and their planes had become the dominant force at sea. But more than that, her story is a reminder of the human cost of war, of the terrible price that is paid when nations clash. 3,000 men died aboard her, and many more died in the battles that followed. Each one was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. As we reflect on the Yamato's story, let us remember not just the tactical lessons or the strategic implications, but the human beings who lived and died within her steel walls. Let us honor their courage, mourn their loss, and resolve to build a world where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. The Yamato sleeps now, in the depths of the East China Sea, her guns silent, her decks empty, her crew at rest. The war that killed her ended 8 decades ago, and the world has moved on to new conflicts and new challenges. But her story remains a testament to human ingenuity and human folly, to courage and tragedy, to the eternal truth that in war there are no unsinkable ships and there are no unwounded survivors. The wreck site has been visited multiple times since its discovery. In 1985, a joint Japanese-American expedition used sonar to locate the remains. In 2019, a more detailed survey was conducted, producing high-resolution images of the wreckage scattered across the seafloor. What they found was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. The great ship had broken into several major pieces during her sinking, torn apart by the catastrophic magazine explosion. The bow section, relatively intact, showed the elegant lines that had made her the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Nearby, the massive anchor, weighing nearly 18 tons, lay half-buried in the sediment. Scattered across a wide area were the personal effects of her crew. Rice bowls and sake cups, uniform buttons and leather belts, the everyday items that the men had used in their final days. Each artifact was a reminder that this was not just a warship, but a floating city, home to more than 3,000 human beings. The expedition teams treated the site with the reverence due to a war grave. They took photographs and measurements, but disturbed nothing, left the dead in peace. The Yamato and her crew had earned that respect. Back in Japan, the families of the fallen gathered each year to remember. At the Yamato Museum in Kure, memorial services were held on the anniversary of the sinking. Elderly men and women, the sons and daughters and grandchildren of those who died, lit incense and offered prayers, keeping alive the memory of their loved ones. Among them was Keiko Watanabe, daughter of Ensign Mitsuo Watanabe. She was just 3 years old when her father sailed away on the Yamato's final voyage, too young to understand what was happening, too young to say goodbye. Her mother had received the letter he wrote the night before departure, had kept it safe through the chaos of Japan's defeat and the hardships of the post-war years. Keiko had read it countless times as she grew older, trying to know the father she could barely remember. In the letter, he had written of his pride in serving aboard the Yamato, of his hope that Japan would find peace, of his love for his family. He had asked his mother to watch over his wife and daughter, to help them through the difficult times that were surely coming. He had said he would be watching over them from the next world. Keiko never married. She devoted her life to honoring her father's memory, to ensuring that his sacrifice and the sacrifices of all the Yamato's crew would not be forgotten. She spoke at schools and community centers, telling the story of the ship and her father, hoping that future generations would learn from the tragedy. When she died in 2021, at the age of 79, she was buried with her father's letter pressed against her heart. Her gravestone bore an inscription she had chosen herself, daughter of the Yamato. The Americans who participated in the attack also carried memories that would last their lifetimes. Many of them later said that sinking the Yamato was the most significant action they had taken during the war and the one that haunted them the most. Lieutenant Commander Richard May, who led the torpedo squadron that scored several hits, became a commercial pilot after the war. He flew routes across the Pacific for decades, sometimes passing over the waters where the Yamato lay. He never spoke much about that day, but those who knew him well said he sometimes grew quiet and withdrawn when the anniversary approached. In a letter written to a fellow veteran years after the war, he confessed that he sometimes dreamed about the Yamato. In his dreams, she was always whole and beautiful, steaming at full speed with her battle flags flying. He would approach in his Avenger, lining up for the attack, and then he would wake up, sweating in the darkness. He did not feel guilty exactly. He knew that sinking the Yamato had saved American lives, had helped bring the war closer to its end. But he could not escape the feeling that he had participated in the destruction of something magnificent, something that the world would never see again. The largest battleship ever built, the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, the symbol of an empire's ambitions, gone in less than 3 hours. For naval historians, the Yamato's sinking remains a subject of endless fascination. They debate the tactical decisions, the strategic implications, the what-ifs and might-have-beens. Could the Yamato have reached Okinawa if she had sailed at night? Would heavier air cover have made a difference? Was Operation Tengo a military necessity or a futile gesture of defiance? These questions have no definitive answers. The men who made the decisions are long dead, their reasons known only to themselves. What remains are the facts. The Yamato sailed, she was attacked, and she sank. 3,000 men died. But the story of the Yamato is more than just a military history lesson. It is a human story, a tale of courage and fear, of duty and sacrifice, of love and loss. It is the story of ordinary men caught up in extraordinary events, doing their best in impossible circumstances. Consider Seaman First Class Kazuo Takahashi, one of the youngest men aboard the Yamato. He was just 17 years old, barely old enough to serve, assigned to one of the anti-aircraft gun crews. He had joined the Navy because his older brothers had served, because his father had been a sailor, because it was expected of him. He was terrified during the attack, he would later admit. The noise was overwhelming, the confusion total. He loaded and fired, following his training without thought, trying to ignore the explosions and the screams around him. When the order to abandon ship came, he hesitated. He did not know how to swim. The ocean had always frightened him, even though he had spent his entire naval career upon it. But his shipmates pushed him toward the railing, told him to jump, and he did. He clung to a piece of wreckage for hours, watching his ship die, watching his friends drown or burn or simply disappear beneath the waves. He was rescued by one of the surviving destroyers, one of only 276 men to survive the sinking. After the war, he became a fisherman, spending his life on the same waters that had claimed so many of his comrades. He never spoke much about his experience, but he observed the anniversary of the sinking every year, lighting incense and praying for the souls of the dead. He lived until 2015, one of the last surviving witnesses to the Yamato's final voyage. When he died, his family scattered his ashes over the site of the wreck, reuniting him at last with his shipmates. Stories like these remind us that history is not just about ships and battles and strategic decisions. It is about people, about the lives they lived and the deaths they died, about the memories they left behind. The Yamato herself was just steel and machinery, designed and built by human hands. But she became something more, a vessel for the hopes and fears of everyone who served aboard her, everyone who built her, everyone who loved someone who never came home. In death, she has become a symbol, different things to different people. To some, she represents the folly of Japanese militarism, the waste of resources and lives in pursuit of an impossible dream. To others, she represents courage and sacrifice, the willingness to face certain death for a cause greater than oneself. Perhaps she is both and more. Perhaps, like all symbols, she contains multitudes, reflecting back whatever we bring to her. What is certain is that she was real, that she lived and fought and died in a specific place at a specific time. What is certain is that more than 3,000 men went down with her, each one an individual with his own story, his own dreams, his own fears. The Japanese High Command had said she was unsinkable. They were wrong. 386 American planes proved them wrong. But in proving them wrong, those American pilots also proved something else. They proved that no weapon, no matter how powerful, can guarantee victory. They proved that wars are won by courage and determination and sacrifice, not by the size of guns or the thickness of armor. They proved that in the end, it is human beings who decide the fate of nations, not the machines they build. The Yamato sleeps now in the depths of the East China Sea. Her guns are silent, her engines are cold, her crew has found their final rest. But her story lives on, passed down through generations, a reminder of what was and what might have been. A reminder of the cost of war and the price of peace. A reminder that even the mightiest can fall, that even the unsinkable can sink. And perhaps that is her true legacy. Not as a warship or a weapon, but as a story. A story of human ambition and human failure, of courage and tragedy, of the eternal struggle between pride and reality. The Japanese High Command said the Yamato was unsinkable. 386 American planes proved them wrong. And in doing so, they wrote the final chapter of the age of the battleship, closing the book on a form of naval warfare that had dominated the seas for generations. The Yamato was the last of her kind, the greatest battleship ever built, and the last to challenge the dominance of aircraft carriers. Her death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new age of naval warfare. She was magnificent, and she was doomed. She was a masterpiece of engineering, and she was a monument to human folly. She was home to 3,000 men who loved her and died with her. She was the Yamato, and this was her story.